We all go through different chapters in our lives, some stranger than others. Welcome to Strange Chapters, where we bring you true stories of the strange, the macabre, the paranormal, and the supernatural. So sit back, relax, and let's get to this week's featured author and their stories. Today we bring you 3 stories from author Robert Keller's Unexplained book series. Robert Keller's books are available on Amazon, Kindle, BarnesandNoble.com, and wherever fine books are sold. You can find the links to Robert Keller's books in the description below. Story 1, Gone in the Night. Jeff Rupe could hardly believe his eyes. It was 4 a.m. on a rotten February morning in Shelby, North Carolina, freezing cold and with rain pouring down from the inky sky. And yet here, on the hard shoulder of NC-18, was a tiny figure, a child, braving the elements as she walked doggedly along the road. Perplexed, almost believing that he was seeing things, Rupe applied the brakes, bringing his 10-wheeler to a skidding halt on the slippery blacktop. Something was wrong here. No child should be out at this hour, least of all in such foul weather. It took several maneuvers to turn the truck around on the 2-lane highway. Once he managed it, Rupe began driving slowly back to the spot where he'd seen the child. It was raining harder now, so hard in fact that he missed her on his first pass. Turning the truck again, he headed back, and now he saw her, a little African-American girl, no older than 10, soaked to the skin in a long-sleeved white t-shirt and white pants, a book bag slung across her back. Stopping his truck behind the child, Rupe leaned out of the cab and called out to her. He wasn't prepared for what happened next. The child suddenly bolted, leaving the road and disappearing into the wooded area that ran alongside. That left Rupe with a problem. He couldn't leave his truck here, obstructing traffic, to go after the girl, and he had little chance of finding her in the dense woods anyway. Confused, he decided to drive on. Later that day, he'd see the child again, this time on TV. By then, the story of Asha Degree's strange disappearance was the biggest news story to hit the area in recent memory. Asha was the daughter of Harold and Aquila Degree, the sister of O'Brien, who was a year older than her. At 9 years of age, Asha was a 4th grade student of Falston Elementary School, where she excelled academically and was a star player on the basketball team. Harold and Aquila were church-going people, and they were extremely protective of their children. There was no internet connection in their home, and Asha and O'Brien were not allowed cell phones. Since both parents worked full-time jobs, the children were under strict instructions to return directly from school to the family's 2-bedroom duplex. They were required to have completed their homework by the time their parents got home from work. That is not to say that Harold and Aquila were overly strict or that their children were deprived of friends. The Degrees had numerous family members living in the area, and Harold's mother and sister lived just across the street. All in all, Asha and O'Brien appeared to be happy, well-adjusted kids. The weekend before Valentine's Day 2000 was a particularly busy one for the Degree family. Saturday was the first day of the basketball season, and both Asha and O'Brien had games. The day, however, would end in disappointment for Asha. She fouled out and her team lost, leaving her distraught and in tears. Later, she calmed down enough to watch her brother's game, and the sting of defeat was softened further when each of the players received a candy hamper to celebrate Valentine's Day. On Saturday night, Asha attended a sleepover along with several of her cousins at the home of a family member. She seemed in good spirits as they stayed up late, dancing and singing and watching television. The following day there was church, and the family enjoyed a quiet afternoon at home. Asha, still tired from the slumber party, went straight to bed after dinner, retiring at 6:30 p.m. At around 8:30 that night, a storm broke over the Shelby area. An hour or so later, there was a car accident that took out the electricity to the neighborhood. The power came back just after midnight, and Aquila, who had been dozing on the couch, went to bed soon after. Harold, unable to sleep, stayed up until around 2:30 a.m. Before he hit the hay, he looked in on the children and found them both sound asleep. Sometime later, O'Brien was aroused when Asha got up to use the bathroom. He drifted back to sleep after she returned and slept through till morning. Valentine's Day had always been a special occasion for the Degree family. Aside from the obvious, it was also Harold and Aquila's wedding anniversary. February 14th, 2000 would mark their 12th year as a married couple, but it was also Monday, which meant work for the older Degrees and school for the children. Aquila rose at around 6 that morning and didn't notice anything unusual until she went to the children's bedroom to wake them. That was when she saw that Asha's bed was empty. One can only imagine the panic that welled up in Aquila's gut at that moment. Panic that increased exponentially as she conducted a quick search of the house and didn't find her daughter. She sprinted to wake Harold, then bolted for the front door and ran out onto the lawn. Screaming for her daughter, Harold was calmer, at least initially. He assumed that Asha had gone across the street to her grandmother's house. A quick phone call proved that this wasn't the case. Harold's next call was to 911. The response from police was rapid. The 911 call was logged at 6:38 a.m. The first police officer arrived on the scene 2 minutes later at 6:40 a.m. Just a couple of minutes after that, Sheriff Dan Crawford arrived, along with several deputies. Crawford immediately called for a canine unit, but it had been raining all night, and the dogs failed to pick up a scent. By now, the media had somehow gotten word of the developing situation, and the first outside unit rolled up. Soon there'd be dozens of newspaper reporters and several television crews, all jockeying for a front row seat to the unfolding drama. One thing that cannot be faulted about this case is the response of the police. Soon a large-scale search was underway with dozens of deputies, assisted by twice as many civilian volunteers. The searchers spread outwards from the Degree residence, moving in every direction since no one knew which way Asha had gone. By noon, the sheriff called for a highway patrol helicopter with infrared heat detection equipment. By 2 p.m., agents of the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation had arrived and secured the home with crime scene tape. Detectives then got to work looking for clues. There was no evidence of forced entry and nothing to indicate that a struggle had taken place inside the home. There was, however, one intriguing lead. Asha's school bag was missing, along with several items of her clothing. In the meantime, the search continued. The number of volunteers now swelled by firefighters from neighboring departments, by the Red Cross, by congregants from Moles Memorial Baptist Church, which the family attended. By evening, the searchers had covered an area 3 miles wide and found nothing. Then came the first solid lead. Jeff Rupe called in and reported the child he'd seen on the highway, the little girl who'd run away when he tried to help her. Jeff, as it turned out, wasn't the only one who spotted the child. Roy Blanton and his son had been on a trucking run from Shelby to Falston when they'd seen her. That was at around 4 p.m. Roy had then put out an alert on a CB radio asking other truckers in the area to keep an eye out for her. Both of these sightings had been on NC-18, and since the child in question was a good fit for Asha, this area, close to the intersection with NC-180, now became the focal point of the search effort. A checkpoint was established here, with commuters stopped and questioned. It was looking, though, as if Asha might have left home on her own accord, as if she was a runaway, except that didn't make sense. By all accounts, Asha was a happy, well-adjusted kid with loving parents and a stable home. She had a close bond with her brother and did well at school. She had plenty of friends at school and at church. She loved playing basketball and was keenly looking forward to the next game to make up for her mistake in the last one. Those were all positive reasons that mitigated against Asha being a runaway, and there were other reasons that made it extremely unlikely. Asha was a shy child who was wary of strangers. She was also afraid of the dark, and so the idea of leaving a warm bed in the middle of a stormy night seemed highly improbable. Aside from that, experts pointed out that children under the age of 12 seldom run away, even in cases of extreme abuse, and clearly there had been no abuse. On Thursday, February 17th, searchers working in the area of NC-18 came across a shed on a property owned by a family named Turner. Here they would find the first trace of Asha Degree since her disappearance 3 days earlier. A candy wrapper lay on the ground, and there were 3 items: a Mickey Mouse-shaped hair bow, a marker, and a pencil that were later confirmed as belonging to Asha. These items were shipped to the FBI crime lab to be analyzed but offered up no clues. The trail was growing cold. By Monday, February 21st, Asha had been missing for a week. 9,000 man-hours had been spent, and every inch of a 3-mile radius around her home had been scoured. Of Asha, though, there was no trace. Over the next 18 months, detectives continued to work the case, diligently chasing down any lead they received, no matter how trivial. Then on August 3, 2001, there was a major break, although not necessarily a promising one. A construction crew was breaking ground on a project in neighboring Burke County when they unearthed an unexpected find: a child's book bag. The construction site was about 6 miles south of Morganton, 30 miles from where Asha had last been seen. The backpack was wrapped in 2 black trash bags and buried in a spot about 50 yards from the NC-18 highway. Any doubt as to who it belonged to was resolved when Asha's name, address, and telephone number were found on a label attached to the bag. The clothing items stashed inside were also identified as hers. However, some of the items found inside the book bag only served to deepen the mystery. The first was the Dr. Seuss book, McElligot's Pool, This had been checked out of the Falston Elementary Media Center, but not by Asha. The second was a New Kids on the Block t-shirt, which Harold and Aquila were certain did not belong to their daughter. Who did these items belong to, and how had they ended up in Asha's bag? The police were convinced that the answer to those questions held the key to Asha's whereabouts. All of their inquiries, however, ran into frustrating dead ends. They would not be resolved in the months that followed or in the years to come. In 2015, with the Asha degree now 15 years gone, the FBI put up a $25,000 reward for information. This was supplemented by a community organization that added $20,000. In the meantime, investigative efforts continued behind the scenes. Cleveland County Detective Tim Adams had come out of retirement the previous year to head up a reinvestigation of the case. The FBI and state police also remained actively involved, meeting several times a month to compare notes. These efforts appeared to bear fruit in 2016 when a tipster reported that Asha had been seen getting into a green Lincoln Continental Mark IV, or possibly an early 1970s Ford Thunderbird, on the night she went missing. According to the informant, the car had rust around its wheel wells. This lead, like all others, led nowhere. It has been 2 decades since Asha Degree left home in the middle of the night and disappeared. In that time, several theories have been put forward to explain what happened to her. None of these has come close to unraveling the mystery. It is generally accepted that Asha walked out of the apartment of her own free will. But why? Some have suggested that she was still upset over the basketball game, and she was afraid to face her teammates that Monday morning, afraid that they would blame her for the loss, but so afraid that she would walk away from everything she knew and loved. In the middle of the night, in the middle of a storm. This was a child who was afraid of the dark, remember? So that reasoning doesn't ring true. Another suggestion is that Asha didn't leave of her own accord, that she was convinced to do so by someone she knew and trusted, someone who had been grooming her. There is some validity to this theory. This did not appear to be a spur-of-the-moment thing. It appeared that Asha had been contemplating this for some time. We don't know why, but perhaps the basketball game provided the final nudge, spurring her into action. But if that is true, then it opens up another question. Who was it that lured Asha away? Given Asha's introverted personality, it certainly would not have been a stranger. It also could not have been anyone online, since she did not have access to the internet. That leaves someone at her school, someone at her church, or someone in her inner circle, a family member. Yet surely if that is what happened, someone would have noticed. An adult or an older teen taking an unnatural interest in a 9-year-old would surely attract attention. Only no one picked up on anything unusual, and Asha never uttered a word, not even to her closest confidant, her brother. The disappearance of Asha Degree remains an impenetrable riddle, one that may never be solved. For Asha's family, hope still lingers that she may be alive and that they might one day see her again. We're hoping and we're praying that she's had a halfway decent life, even though we didn't get to raise her, Aquila says. She was 9 years old and she'll be 30 this year, so we've missed everything, but I don't care. If she walked in the door right now, I wouldn't care what I missed. All I want to do is see her. Story 2. Time Stands Still. You could easily imagine this is the opening scene of a horror movie. A bus traverses the darkened streets of a town. Only one passenger is aboard, a young man in a U.S. Air Force uniform. He looks to be a little more than a teenager. After some distance, the bus comes to a stop outside a dark storefront. The driver turns and tells his passenger that this is his stop. Are you sure? The young airman asks. There's nobody here. The driver assures him that this is the place. Just use the payphone to call the base, he says. They'll send someone to pick you up. This scene from our imaginary horror film is not fiction, but what really happened to 19-year-old Robert Matthews on the night of October 1st, 1966. Matthews was reporting for his first posting at North Truro Air Force Station, just outside the village of North Truro in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. The stop he just alighted at was outside the shuttered premises of Dutra's Market. It was pitch black, darker than a city boy like Robert Matthews could ever have imagined. Matthews checked his watch and noted that it was 8:45 p.m. He walked to the phone and made his call. The voice on the other end told him a truck would be there to collect him in a few minutes. The words were a relief to Robert. He was beginning to feel a little uneasy. Although he would never admit it to anyone, Robert Matthews was sometimes afflicted by nyctophobia, fear of the dark. This anxiety stemmed from his childhood. At the age of 5, Robert had been visited in his bedroom by a terrifying creature, a glowing green presence with large black eyes. The being had pulled back the covers and lifted his pajama top. It had spent several moments probing at his chest. Robert had tried to scream, but no sound came. He tried to run, but he was unable to move his legs. When he told his mother about it the next morning, she assured him that it was just a nightmare. Robert wasn't so sure. To him, the experience had seemed all too real. 14 years had passed since that terrifying childhood experience, but Robert Matthews had never forgotten it. Now here he stood in the dark outside of Dutra's, anxiously awaiting his ride. A glance at his watch told him that a minute had elapsed. He cast an eye along the road, hoping to catch a glimpse of approaching headlights. Nothing. It was at this moment that Matthew's attention was drawn toward the heavens. There he saw them, a trio of lights crossing the sky from right to left, moving at speed and in tight formation. Immediately, he sensed an increase in his heartbeat, a knot in his belly, a constriction in his throat. Those lights, for some reason, filled him with a feeling of intense dread. There was something unusual about them. The way they moved did not seem natural to him. He decided to call the base and report what he was seeing. But Matthews was not prepared for the response that he got. "Where the hell have you been?" the voice on the other end demanded. Matthews responded that he had been right there, outside Dutra's, waiting for his ride. "No, you haven't," the voice insisted. "The truck got there 5 minutes after you called. You were nowhere to be found." This statement greatly confused Matthews. He knew that he had been standing at this exact spot all the while. How could the driver possibly have missed him? In fact, it hadn't even been 5 minutes. So how could the truck have arrived 5 minutes after his call? He glanced at his watch to confirm that assessment. That was when everything in Robert Matthews' life changed. The hands on the timepiece stood at 9:45. Somehow he had lost an hour. A second truck was dispatched to bring Matthews to the base. When he got there, he was ushered into a room and questioned for hours by a man in civilian clothes. Matthews stuck steadfastly to his story. He remembered standing outside the market, seeing the lights in the sky, and making his second call. To him, it felt like just 4 minutes had passed, 5 at best. He could not account for the missing hour. The interrogator did not believe him. He accused Matthews of being drunk and dismissed him with a warning not to repeat this ridiculous story to anyone. It was an inauspicious start to his military career. Nonetheless, Robert Matthews was served with distinction, including several tours in Vietnam. The strange incident at Truro stayed with him, though, stored in his memory alongside his childhood encounter with the Green Man. Sometimes he wondered if the two were somehow connected. Fast forward now to 1987. Robert Matthews is 40 years old and long since retired from the military. He is in an airport, heading out on vacation, browsing a bookstore for something to read on the flight. That is when he spots a book called Missing Time by author Bud Hopkins. Matthews is stunned. The illustration on the cover of the paperback is all too familiar to him. It is a creature that visited him in his room when he was a child. The content of the book was even more fascinating. Bud Hopkins was a Cape Cod painter and sculptor who developed an interest in UFOs after a supposed sighting of an alien craft off the Massachusetts coast in August 1964. His particular field was alien abduction. Hopkins firmly believed in the idea and claimed that humans were frequently whisked away on alien craft for the purposes of genetic experimentation. In Missing Time, he examines the first-hand accounts of 7 alleged abductees as they recount their terrifying tales of being taken aboard alien ships. None of these individuals had direct remembrance of the events. All gave their evidence under hypnosis. The common theme was that they had all experienced the phenomenon of missing time, the same thing that had happened to Matthews in North Truro back in the 1960s. Many commentators have dismissed Bud Hopkins as a kook, but Robert Matthews was not inclined to do so. How could he when he had experienced the very thing that Hopkins described in his book? Instead, Matthews decided to write to Hopkins, to tell his story and, possibly, to gain some answers. That letter received a swift response, inviting him to meet with the author. After initial discussions, Matthews agreed to be hypnotized by Hopkins. The answers were within reach. Finally, Robert Matthews would learn the truth about his missing hour. Bud Hopkins had no formal training in psychology. During his early exploration of the abductee phenomenon, he employed outside professionals to conduct the hypnotic regression sessions. However, he found that the ingrained skepticism of these psychologists was a hindrance. And so, over a period of 8 years, he watched and learned and eventually developed his own methods. Now he took Robert Matthews back to that October night in 1966 and put him back on the darkened street in front of Dutra's Market. In a trance, Matthews started to describe what he saw. The lights in the sky getting nearer, a strange craft touching down in the adjacent lot, 2 beings exiting, approaching, leading him on board, 2 more waiting there to receive him. Matthews was strapped to a sort of operating table as the craft took soundlessly into the air. Now the aliens returned to Matthews. They undid his shirt and started probing at his chest. Eventually, they appeared to have completed their examination. The craft returned to Earth, and Matthews was ushered out, with no recollection of what happened to him. Now, in his hypnotic state, he had a revelation. The creatures that had abducted him from Truro were the same ones that had visited him in his room as a child. They had been watching him for years. The story of Robert Matthews' abduction is a difficult one to swallow. What makes it worthy of our attention is that it is so similar in detail to countless others recorded by Bud Hopkins and other researchers. Hopkins alone documented hundreds of cases in his lifetime, most of them with recurring themes and narratives. Does that make them real, valid, credible? No, says science. Many experts have pointed out a substantial flaw in Bud Hopkins' methodology. Subjects under regressive hypnosis are susceptible to suggestion. They may recall events that have occurred, and later, after being brought out of hypnosis, be convinced that these events were real. False memory syndrome is a real condition. It is for this reason that information gained under hypnosis is disallowed in most courtrooms. But does this debunk Robert Matthews' story? Does it invalidate the testimony of Bud Hopkins' other subjects? The answer to that question is no. As the Bard noted, there are more things under heaven and earth than we could ever know. We've all had that experience where we drift away for a couple minutes and return to consciousness with no awareness of where those lost moments have gone. We berate ourselves for losing focus, for wool gathering. Bud Hopkins would have us believe that there might sometimes be more to it than that. Story 3, Below Zero. Back in the early 70s, Gary Dale Mathias had been a U.S. serviceman stationed in West Germany. But Gary had developed a drug problem and had eventually received a medical discharge after he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Thereafter, he returned to his hometown of Yuba City, California, where he was employed in his father's landscaping business. Stelazine and Cogentin were prescribed to control his symptoms, and he was treated as an outpatient at a local VA hospital. He also started attending the Yuba City Gateway Rehabilitation Center. It was there that he met Jack McDruga, a fellow veteran, and through him, 3 other regulars at the facility, Jackie Hewitt, Ted Weir, and William Sterling. The 5 of them would soon become inseparable. What is unique about this group of friends is that all of them had psychiatric or developmental issues. Mathias, as we already know, was schizophrenic. The other 4 were intellectually impaired and considered slow learners. All of them lived at home with their parents, who referred to them collectively as the boys. They shared a common love of sports, but were particularly interested in basketball. At the rehabilitation center, they formed a team, which they called the Gateway Gators. On February 25th, 1978, the Gators were due to play their first game in a tournament sponsored by the Special Olympics. The prize for the winners was a week-long trip to Los Angeles, all expenses paid. The night before the tournament was a time of high excitement for the 5 members of the Gators team. Uniforms were laid out and sports bags packed, ready for the coming day's events. Ted Weir was particularly pumped up. He asked his mother to wash his new white high-top sneakers and kept reminding her to wake him up on time. "Don't let me oversleep," he cautioned. "We got a big game Saturday." Before playing their first game, though, the Gators would attend another matchup, UC Davis versus CSU Chico. This was an away game for Davis, and that meant a 50-mile drive to Chico, California, in the upper Sacramento Valley. The boys departed that evening in Ted Madruga's turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego. They were there to cheer Davis to victory, no doubt dreaming about the cheers that would be directed at them within the next 12 hours or so. After leaving the university campus at around 10 p.m., they stopped 3 blocks away at Bears Market, piling in just before the doors closed to buy snacks and sodas for the homeward journey. The store clerk remembered them clearly since she was about to cash up and was annoyed at the last-minute intrusion. From there, it was an easy 50-minute drive straight down Highway 70 to Yuba City. But the boys never met at home that night and had still not arrived by daybreak. By then, anxious calls had been exchanged between their parents, and the decision had been taken to call the Yuba County Sheriff's Department. A search was then launched, with deputies from Yuba and Butte counties driving the route they would have followed from Chico. They found no trace of the men or their vehicle. That was to remain as the status quo until Tuesday, February 28th, when a forest ranger found the car abandoned on a dirt road near Oroville in the Plumas National Forest. The location of the vehicle had investigators scratching their heads. What was it doing here, up in the mountains, a 2-hour drive from Chico, in the opposite direction from the route they should have taken? And why had the car been abandoned when it was fully operational and still had a quarter tank of gas? Why abandon it here to step out into frigid conditions which none of the men were dressed for. These were questions that would require answers, but for now, the priority was to find the missing men. A search was therefore launched, with forest rangers exploring the wilderness on snowmobiles. The operation would continue for 5 days before it was eventually called off due to adverse weather conditions. A vicious blizzard was ripping through the area, depositing almost 9 inches of snow on the ground. After that, the possibility of finding any tracks was gone, and if any of the men was caught outside in those conditions, he stood zero chance of survival. The police, meanwhile, were following a different strategy, appealing for information via the media. They were soon inundated with tips. Most of these were easily dismissed, but 2 were considered worthwhile. The first of these was from a man named Joseph Shawns. Shawns had been driving the Oroville-Quincy Road that evening when his car got stuck in the snow. He'd gotten out to try to free his vehicle from a rut. As he did so, he experienced a sudden jab of pain in his chest and realized that he was having a heart attack. He then pulled himself back into the car and slumped into the driver's seat. He turned up the engine and got the heat going, hoping he could wait it out until help arrived. About 6 hours later, with the pain barely subsided, Shawns saw headlights approaching and a car stopped behind him. Shawns heard voices and called out for help. Then the lights were swiftly extinguished and the voices stopped. Then Shawns saw flashlights, which were again turned off when he called out. He would eventually make his own way to safety once the pain in his chest subsided. The police were certain that the individuals he saw were the missing U of 5, even though Shawns insisted that one of them was a woman holding a baby. He'd later admit that he was delirious with pain and might have been mistaken. The other reported sighting was by a clerk who worked at a store in Brownsville, a tiny hamlet about 30 miles from where the Mercury Montego was found abandoned. She claimed that 4 of the men had stopped at the store in a red pickup truck 2 days after their disappearance. 2 of them waited outside while the other 2 entered the store and bought burritos, chocolate milk, and soda. The descriptions she gave were a close approximation of the missing men, offering hope that they might still be alive. Certainly the sheriff thought that the sighting was valid. He would be proven wrong in that regard. 3 months passed without news of the men or any clue as to their whereabouts. On June 4th, with most of the snow now melted away, a group of motorcyclists took a ride up the Oroville-Quincy Road and then veered off the main path towards a campsite, around 19 miles into the trees. The Forest Service maintained a trailer here, and that's where the bikers were headed. Arriving at the site, they noticed immediately that the front window of the trailer had been smashed. Approaching it, they picked up a noxious odor coming from within. One of the men then entered the trailer, only to come staggering out a moment later. There was a dead body inside. The corpse, identified by dental records, turned out to be Ted Weir. Then, as the police and Forest Service launched a search of the area, they recovered 2 more bodies, Jack Madruga and William Sterling. These were about 8 miles from the trailer on either side of the road. Madruga's body had been partially consumed by animals. Sterling's had been reduced to a pile of scattered bones. Autopsies would determine that they had died of hypothermia. 3 of the missing men had not been accounted for, while the fate of the other 2 remained uncertain. 2 days later, that number was reduced to 1 when Jack Hewitt's father, who joined the search as a civilian volunteer, found a human spine concealed in heavy brush 2 miles northeast of the trailer. The following day, a deputy sheriff discovered a skull about 300 foot downhill. The bones were all that remained of Jack Hewitt. He too had succumbed to hypothermia. Of the final member of the party, Gary Mathias, no trace has ever been found. He's presumed to have died on the mountain. So how are we to unravel this tragedy? What happened on the mountainside that night? The scenario that is usually presented is that Jack Madruga got lost after leaving Chico and ended up on the Oroville-Quincy Road. There, the car got stuck in the snow and the group decided to abandon it. Spotting snowmobile tracks, they decided to follow, believing that the tracks would bring them to a cabin. In fact, the tracks had been made the previous day by a forest ranger, headed for the trailer to replenish supplies there. The men had no way of knowing that it was 19 miles away. None of the men were dressed for the frigid weather, and soon they all began to feel the effects of hypothermia. Sterling was particularly afflicted. After covering 11 miles in the bone-numbing cold, he lay down in the snow and refused to go on. This is a common symptom of hypothermia, an overwhelming need to sleep. In any case, Madruga refused to abandon Sterling and stay behind, perishing with him in the snow. The other 3 continued on and against all odds made it to the trailer. They remained there through most of the winter, perhaps as long as 13 weeks. We know this because of the length of Ted Weir's beard and because he lost almost half his body weight in that time. Eventually, after Weir's death, Hewitt and Mathias decided to find their way back to civilization. They struck out in different directions, only to perish in the wilderness. This is a sensible explanation, stringing a plausible series of events into a quite convincing narrative. However, it raises a multitude of questions for which there are simply no answers. The first of these is that Jack Madruga got so hopelessly lost that the group ended up miles off track, driving in the opposite direction. This makes no sense. The route between Chico and Yuba is as simple as they come, a straight shot down CA 70 without ever having to leave the highway. It has all been impossible to lose one's way along this route. The second anomaly is that the Mercury became so hopelessly stuck in the snow that the men had to abandon it. This simply isn't true. While the car was most certainly stuck, it could easily have been pushed out of the rut by the 5-foot young men on board. Why didn't they do so? Then there is the route the men decided to take after leaving the car. On the way up the mountain, they would have passed a lodge, which was about 8 miles from the spot where they eventually got stuck. This was the same cabin that Joseph Shawns made his way to after suffering his heart attack. Why didn't the Yuba 5 do likewise? Why not head back down the hill where they knew they'd find help? Why trudge off into the darkness with no certain destination in mind? None of these questions have ever been answered to anyone's satisfaction, but the greatest enigmas have to do with the time that Weir, Hewitt, and Matthias spent at the trailer. Ted Weir's death was attributed to a combination of starvation and hypothermia, yet neither food nor heat should have been a problem for the men sheltering in the trailer. The place contained an ample supply of matches and stacks of paperback novels that could have been used as kindling, and there were plenty of twigs and branches to be found on the ground outside. Heavy coats hung in a closet, which would have protected the men from the cold. Inexplicably, these were left untouched. In addition, there was a butane tank in a nearby shed attached to the trailer's heating system. It was never turned on. There was also plenty of food in the trailer. About a dozen military C-ration cans were indeed opened and presumably consumed. Yet a pantry full of dehydrated foods, enough to feed the 3 men for a year, were left untouched. At the time that Ted Weir was wasting away, at the time that he suffered such severe frostbite that his feet ballooned up and became gangrenous, both food and heat were quite literally an arm's length away. Why not use them? One suggestion, offered by Weir's family, was that Ted simply lacked common sense. They described an incident when a fire broke out at their home and Ted refused to leave his bed, saying that he'd be late for work the next day if he did not get a good night's sleep. They had dragged him from the house as the flames took hold. But while the lack of smarts might have held for Weir, and perhaps for Hewitt, it was not true of Gary Matthias. The ex-military man would have known how to survive in the wilderness, especially when surviving simply meant sitting tight, consuming the readily available rations, and keeping warm with the readily available heat source. Why he chose not to do so remains an unfathomable mystery. Well, that's it for this week. Hope y'all enjoyed those 3 stories from author Robert Keller's Unexplained series of books. Make sure you click those links below and go check out the rest of his books and the rest of the amazing stories. Also, make sure that you share and subscribe to help more people discover strange chapters. We'll see you next time. Stay safe out there.